The grand hall was alive with laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses, yet for her, the room felt hollow. Lavish chandeliers hung like frozen stars from the ceiling, their golden light spilling across the polished marble floors, illuminating faces full of joy, families celebrating unities and bonds she had always observed from the shadows. She sat at a corner table, almost invisible, the edges of her dark dress blending with the shadows cast by the towering pillars. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, fingers intertwined, as though holding onto a fragile thread of courage. Around her, the wedding feast unfolded in all its grandeur. Long tables stretched across the hall, overflowing with exotic fruits, roasted meats, delicate pastries, and golden goblets filled with sparkling wine. Servants in crisp uniforms moved gracefully between tables, offering platters to the guests, while musicians played a soft waltz in the background. Everyone had someone to laugh with, someone to share the warmth of the evening, but she had only silence. She had come reluctantly, forced by polite insistence from friends who believed she needed a change of scenery, and the chance to meet someone, anyone. The thought had felt unbearable. To sit alone, to be seen, yet unseen, as if she were part of the decor. And so she had chosen the corner of the room where the shadows were thickest, where no one would notice the quiet of her presence. Her eyes wandered across the crowd, catching glimpses of the bride in her intricate gown, sparkling with beads and sequins, laughing with her friends, and the groom, who exuded confidence and charm, every step he took met with admiration. Their happiness, so palpable, felt like a silent accusation against her solitude. She drew a shallow breath, feeling the familiar sting of loneliness creep into her chest. It was then that she noticed him. The Alpha King. He stood at the opposite end of the hall, commanding attention without even trying. Every movement he made, every turn of his head, every casual brush of his fingers against the fabric of his tailored coat, seemed to demand respect. He was impossibly tall, with broad shoulders that made the finely tailored suit he wore appear almost insignificant. Dark hair fell perfectly over his forehead, and his eyes, oh, those eyes, scanned the room with an intensity that could make the strongest warrior falter. She had heard stories of him, of his power, his influence, and his ruthless reputation. He was a man who got what he wanted, who never tolerated weakness. Yet, somehow, he looked exactly at her, and for the first time, the room no longer felt so empty. A faint smirk played at the corner of his lips, subtle but deliberate, as if he had spotted something intriguing amidst the sea of faces. She shifted uncomfortably, drawing the edge of her shawl closer around her shoulders, but her curiosity was stronger than her caution. He began moving toward her, each step purposeful, slicing through the crowd as though he parted the sea of celebrants. Whispers spread through the hall, but she did not notice them. All she could see was him. When he finally reached her table, he leaned slightly closer, the heat of his presence almost tangible. "Why are you sitting here all alone?" His voice was smooth, yet commanding, rich with authority. She opened her mouth to respond, but words fled from her mind, leaving only a quiet fluttering of nerves. He chuckled softly, not unkindly, and took a seat across from her without waiting for an invitation. The table between them suddenly felt like a barrier that didn't exist, and the world around her blurred into insignificance. "Do you always hide in the shadows at celebrations like this?" he asked, his gaze sharp yet amused. She hesitated, her heart pounding like a frantic drum. I suppose I just prefer observing." "Observing," he repeated, the corner of his mouth curling into a more mischievous smile. "Interesting choice. Most people fear being alone because it reveals too much. Perhaps you are not most people." The room continued its symphony of laughter and music, but for her, time seemed to slow. The Alpha King's attention, his mere presence, wrapped around her like a protective cloak. Her chest tightened with an unfamiliar warmth. Was it fear, excitement, or the delicate stirrings of curiosity? Perhaps all three. Then, quite suddenly, he leaned forward, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "Act like you're with me," he said, almost as a command, yet with a hint of invitation, a subtle challenge. Her heart skipped a beat. To act as if she belonged to someone as formidable as him, even for a moment, could she dare? The thought was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. She glanced around the hall, at the sea of unfamiliar faces, and realized something that surprised her. She didn't want to be invisible anymore. "Me? she whispered, almost to herself. Exactly, he replied, his dark eyes locked onto hers, unwavering, irresistible. Tonight, no one will see you as alone. Only with me. A shiver ran down her spine, equal parts fear and exhilaration. She nodded, ever so slightly, and for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to feel noticed, important, alive. As he extended his hand toward her, the world outside the table, the music, the laughter, the light, faded into the background. The corner of the hall no longer held shadows, it was a stage, and she was about to step into a story she never thought she'd belong to. And so, the quiet girl who sat alone at the wedding feast began a night that would change everything, without even realizing that the Alpha King had already decided she was not someone to be overlooked ever again. The evening had only just begun, yet the air in the grand hall seemed heavier now, thick with anticipation and curiosity. Where moments ago she had been invisible, the girl at the corner table had suddenly become the center of an unspoken storm. Whispers floated through the air like silk threads, delicate yet persistent. Guests glanced at them, some with surprise, some with curiosity, and a few with envy. But she barely noticed. Her focus had narrowed, like a candle flickering against the dark, fixed entirely on the Alpha King sitting across from her. He did not rush her, did not press for words she was too startled to find. Instead, he exuded patience, a quiet command that demanded attention without force. His eyes, dark and unyielding, traced the curves of her face as if memorizing them, cataloging every subtle expression, every small gesture. A soft, almost imperceptible smile tugged at his lips, and it was a smile that spoke of secrets, of promises yet unspoken. The music shifted as a new melody began, a gentle waltz that swirled through the hall, beckoning couples to the dance floor. The Alpha King's gaze lifted toward the crowd, scanning the dancers with an air of detachment, before returning to her, and in that glance, she felt the pull of inevitability. It was as if the very rhythm of the night conspired to draw her from her shadowed corner into the center of a world she had always observed but never belonged to. Without a word, he extended his hand toward her once more, the simple gesture commanding more than authority, it demanded trust. Her breath caught in her throat as she hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. Around them, the hall continued to shimmer with laughter, candlelight, and music, but for her, the noise faded into a gentle hum. It was just the two of them now, suspended in a bubble of anticipation, as if the universe itself had paused to witness what would happen next. She placed her hand lightly in his, and the sensation was electric, warm, grounding, and terrifying all at once. He led her gracefully toward the dance floor, navigating through the throng of dancers with a precision that was almost predatory. And yet, there was no malice in his movements, only purpose, a careful orchestration that made her feel protected, seen, and, unexpectedly, desired. As they reached the center of the floor, the Alpha King held her close, one hand firm at her waist, the other cradling hers with ease. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her palm, a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the music, pulling her into a cadence she had never known she could follow. The world tilted slightly, colors and lights blending into a swirl of gold, crimson, and shadow, and for the first time, she realized that she was not merely participating in the night, she was part of its story. Around them, couples moved in practiced harmony, but their dance was different. It was not merely steps or rhythm, it was a silent conversation, a delicate negotiation of space and presence, each movement carrying unspoken words. He did not speak, yet his intent was clear. This was a dance of discovery, an introduction not only to him but to the power he wielded and the life he promised she could share. Her initial nervousness began to dissolve under the heat of his gaze and the steady rhythm of his movements. She began to match his steps, not perfectly, but with growing confidence, each sway and turn a declaration that she belonged, at least in this fleeting, suspended moment, to something larger than herself. She felt eyes upon them, whispered remarks fluttering through the air, but she no longer cared. She was anchored by his presence, buoyed by an invisible tether that seemed to pull her toward a destiny she had never imagined. The Alpha King's voice finally cut through the music, low and rich, brushing against her ear. "You move more naturally than I expected," he said, amusement dancing in his tone. "And yet, there's something in your hesitation, a spark. Don't hide it. Never hide it. Her cheeks flushed, warmth spreading like wildfire through her body, and she realized with a quiet shock that she was smiling. Truly smiling, without effort or pretense, and it frightened her how much she wanted him to notice. I'm not used to this, she whispered, almost shyly, yet she did not pull away. Neither am I, he admitted, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, a confession wrapped in a promise. But some things are worth learning, and some people are worth the risk. The dance continued, each step weaving a fragile, delicate connection between them, one that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Her heart, which had been content to beat in quiet solitude, now raced with a new energy, fear, excitement, and anticipation intertwining until it was impossible to tell where one ended and another began. Time seemed to stretch and bend as the night deepened. The music shifted again, softer now, more intimate, a tune that invited secrets rather than ceremony. Guests began to leave the dance floor, retreating to their tables or to quiet corners for whispered conversations, leaving the space around them more private, more suspended in its own universe. He leaned closer, and she could feel the heat of his breath against her skin, the subtle, intoxicating scent of him, power, confidence, and something wild, untamed. Tell me your name, he murmured, Th. Ow, it was not a question but a command draped in velvet. She hesitated, caught off guard by the intimacy of the request. Liana, she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. Liana, he repeated, tasting the syllables as if savoring something rare. A beautiful name for someone who belongs in the light, not hiding in the shadows. Her pulse quickened at the words, at the certainty in his tone, the way he claimed her presence without permission yet demanded none of her fear. She had never met anyone who wielded attention so effortlessly, who could strip away defenses without cruelty or manipulation. And yet, she realized, it was not only attention he wielded, it was care, subtle and unyielding, a force that made her feel safe even as it made her tremble. The waltz ended, but he did not release her hand. Instead, he guided her toward a secluded balcony overlooking the gardens, where the soft glow of lanterns lit the night like scattered stars. The air outside was cool, carrying the fragrance of blooming night flowers, and for a moment, the noise and chaos of the hall vanished entirely. She turned to him, unsure, vulnerable, but the Alpha King's presence enveloped her, steady and unshakable. Tonight is only the beginning, he said softly, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her knees weak. You may have sat alone at the feast, Liana, but that ends now. You are not alone. Not ever. Her breath caught, emotions churning like a storm within her chest. She wanted to speak, to confess the whirlwind of feelings she did not yet understand, but words failed her. Instead, she allowed herself to simply exist in that moment, held, noticed, and inexplicably cherished by a man who seemed to defy every expectation she had ever held of the world. And as the moon cast silver light over the garden, illuminating her in its gentle glow, she realized something profound. For the first time in her life, she no longer feared the spotlight. For the first time, she wanted to step fully into the story that had chosen her, even if she did not yet understand how it would unfold. The night had settled like a velvet curtain over the city, muffling the distant sounds of celebrations beyond the castle walls. Liana felt the cool breeze of the balcony against her skin, a whisper of freedom brushing through her hair, and yet she remained rooted in place, anchored by the presence of the Alpha King beside her. He had not yet spoken again, and that silence was not awkward, it was deliberate, heavy with unspoken meaning, allowing her a glimpse into a world she had never known but instinctively recognized as hers to step into. She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, she noticed the subtle intricacies of his features. The faint lines at the corners of his eyes hinted at laughter and struggles long endured. The way his jaw flexed with thought betrayed a mind always in motion, calculating, observing, protecting. And beneath that formidable exterior, there was a softness in the curve of his mouth, a vulnerability he allowed no one else to see. Do you always stand alone, even at night like this? He finally asked, his voice low, almost reverent, as if afraid to disturb the fragile moment they shared. Liana shook her head slightly, though her voice trembled when she answered. I've never really belonged anywhere, she admitted, the words tasting foreign on her tongue. Even in a crowd, I've always felt invisible. He considered her for a long moment, the intensity of his gaze making her heart flutter like a bird trapped in her chest. Invisible, he repeated thoughtfully. I don't believe anyone should ever feel that way. Not tonight, not ever again. Especially not you. The words wrapped around her like a cloak, warming her despite the chill of the night air. She wanted to reach out, to touch him, to anchor herself in the undeniable reality of his presence, but hesitation rooted her in place. She had lived so long in the shadows that stepping into light felt perilous, even intoxicating. He seemed to sense her inner struggle. Gently, he extended his hand, the same hand that had guided her onto the dance floor earlier, and this time, she did not hesitate. When her fingers touched his, electricity surged between them, a subtle current that spoke of unspoken promises and the possibility of a life neither of them could yet fully imagine. You are stronger than you think, he said, voice steady, yet softer than she had expected. Strength isn't always visible. Sometimes it's quiet, hidden beneath layers no one else can see. That's why I notice it in you. Liana's chest tightened. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. Her life had been a series of whispered dismissals and overlooked moments. Yet here was someone, a man of immense power and presence, seeing her, truly seeing her, and making her feel that her existence mattered. Why me? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. The question escaped before she could stop it, raw and vulnerable, carrying all the insecurities she had buried for years. He turned slightly to face her fully, the moonlight catching the edges of his features and casting shadows that made him appear almost ethereal. Why not you? He countered gently, his tone challenging and sincere at the same time. Because you are different. I can see it, and I rarely see anything truly different in this world anymore. For a long moment, silence fell between them, filled not with emptiness but with unspoken recognition. The night stretched out endlessly, a canvas waiting for the first brushstroke of a story yet to be told. Liana felt the stirrings of something dangerous yet thrilling, hope, excitement, and a spark of courage she had thought long extinguished. Then, as if breaking some invisible barrier, he leaned closer, and the warmth of his breath brushed against her cheek. She could feel the subtle heat radiating from him, grounding her, daring her, pulling her into a world where fear and desire intertwined. Tell me about yourself, he whispered, the words meant for her ears alone. Not the stories you share with strangers. Not the version of you the world expects. I want to know the real Liana. Her throat tightened. She had spent her life learning to hide, to protect herself behind layers of politeness and invisibility. But now, with him, the walls she had built felt brittle, fragile, and unnecessary. Slowly, hesitantly, she began to speak, her voice soft but gaining strength with every word. She told him about her childhood, the quiet moments of longing, the dreams she had kept hidden, and the fears that had always held her back. She spoke of shadows, of loneliness, and of the moments she had dared to hope for something better but had never believed it possible. He listened without interruption, his gaze unwavering, his hand holding hers with gentle reassurance. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding, and as she spoke, Liana realized with a shock that she was crying. Soft, silent tears that had nothing to do with sadness but everything to do with relief. For the first time in her life, someone saw her, truly saw her, and accepted everything she had tried to hide. When her voice faltered, he reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face with a tenderness that made her heart ache. You are remarkable, he said quietly. Not because you are flawless, but because you endure. Because you fight. Because, despite everything, you continue to shine, even when the world insists you remain in darkness. Liana blinked up at him, overwhelmed by the sincerity of his words. She wanted to speak, to protest, to claim that she was not worthy, but something in his presence made her pause. His strength was not in dominance alone, it was in protection, in recognition, in the quiet certainty that she belonged, here, with him. As the night deepened, the moon casting silver light over the balcony, she realized that this was a turning point. The solitude that had defined her life, that had haunted her for so many years, was beginning to fade. In its place, a new reality was forming, a reality where she was seen, valued, and wanted. And the Alpha King, enigmatic and commanding, was at the center of it, not as a threat, but as a guide, a protector, and perhaps something more. For the first time, Liana allowed herself to hope. 2. Believe that happiness, once so distant and unattainable, might now be within reach. And as she stood there, hand in hand with the man who had pulled her from the shadows, she felt the fragile beginnings of a story that would change everything, her story, his story, and the story they were about to write together. The days that followed the wedding feast were unlike any Liana had ever known. The memory of that night lingered in her mind, vivid as if painted in gold and shadow, each detail etched into her consciousness. The warmth of his hand, the intensity of his gaze, the soft power in his voice that had left her trembling and exhilarated at once. She had returned to her usual life, yet the world now seemed different, brighter, and infinitely more dangerous in the most tantalizing way. It began subtly. A letter arrived at her doorstep, sealed with an unfamiliar insignia, elegant yet commanding. She had hesitated before breaking the wax, fearing what might be contained within, yet curiosity, an impulse she rarely indulged, won. The script was bold and deliberate, the words unmistakable. Meet me at the old estate. Tonight. There is something you must see. Her pulse quickened. The words were simple, yet beneath them thrummed an unspoken authority, a promise, and a challenge all at once. She knew, with an almost instinctive certainty, that the Alpha King had sent it. Despite the careful composure she tried to maintain, her heart raced, and her fingers trembled as she folded the letter and tucked it safely into her pocket. Night fell with a quiet intensity, wrapping the city in shadows and moonlight. She moved through the streets, careful to avoid the main thoroughfares, her thoughts a tangle of anticipation and fear. The old estate was a place of legend, whispered about in hushed tones by those who dared speculate on the Alpha King's life beyond the public eye. It stood at the edge of the city, a sprawling structure of stone and ivy, its windows glowing faintly as if inviting her into a secret world. As she approached, the front doors opened with a soft creak, and he was there, waiting. The sight of him, tall and imposing against the dim light of the estate, made her heart leap with a mixture of relief and awe. He extended his hand toward her, the same gesture that had once drawn her into the dance of the wedding feast, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. You came, he said simply, his voice carrying both approval and something softer, more intimate. I did, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. But what is this place? Why am I here? He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets. This is where few are allowed, and fewer still are trusted. Tonight, you are neither a guest nor a stranger. Tonight, you are here because you are meant to be. Inside, the estate was a labyrinth of grandeur and mystery. Rich tapestries lined the walls, depicting battles, alliances, and histories she could barely comprehend. Chandeliers hung from the ceilings, casting fractured light across polished floors. The air was thick with the scent of rare flowers and old wood, and somewhere in the distance, a fire crackled, sending waves of warmth through the halls. He led her through room after room, each filled with artifacts, portraits, and treasures that spoke of a life she had only glimpsed in stories of power and legend. Yet it was not the opulence that captivated her, it was the sense of history, of legacy, and of responsibility. He moved with ease through the halls, as if every corner, every shadow, belonged to him, and in that, she realized the true weight of his existence. Finally, they reached a secluded room, dimly lit, its windows open to the moonlight. A single chair sat in the center, and upon it rested a small chest, intricately carved and locked with an ornate key. He gestured toward it. This belonged to my family long before I was born. Inside, you will find truths I cannot yet speak aloud. Her curiosity flared, mingling with a touch of fear. Truths? About what? About you, about me, and about the world that exists beyond what you've ever known, he replied, his voice steady but low, commanding her attention. Some truths are difficult to bear, but you are ready. I believe that. Liana knelt before the chest, her hands trembling as she traced the delicate carvings. There was a weight in the air, a gravity that made the hair on her arms stand on end. She unlocked it, revealing its contents. Letters, journals, and artifacts that hinted at a life intertwined with power, responsibility, and a lineage she had never imagined. Each item told a story, each page whispered secrets that beckoned her closer to a reality she had only glimpsed in dreams. He knelt beside her, guiding her hand to the first journal. These were written by those who came before me, chronicling not only victories but also sacrifices. You see, Liana, to be close to someone like me is not merely a matter of choice, it is a matter of destiny." She looked up at him, startled by the intensity in his gaze. "Destiny?" she echoed, her voice barely audible. "Yes," he said firmly, brushing a strand of hair from her face with a gentle reverence that made her heart ache. "And yours is entwined with mine in ways you cannot yet fully understand. But tonight, you take the first step in learning what it truly means to belong, to be seen, to be protected." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the city beyond. Liana felt a mixture of awe, fear, and exhilaration. She had lived her life in shadows, yet here, she realized she had been stepping toward the light all along, guided by a force she could not resist and a man she could no longer deny. He leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching hers, and the world narrowed to the space between their breaths. "Tonight is more than a meeting, Liana," he whispered. "It is an awakening. And I promise you, when you leave this room, nothing will ever be the same." And she knew, with an undeniable certainty, that he was right. The path she had taken to this moment had led her here, to a place where shadows and light intertwined, where danger and desire coexisted, and where a story far larger than her own was waiting to unfold. As she looked into his eyes, she understood the truth he offered without words. She was no longer invisible, and with him, she never would be again. The following morning, sunlight streamed into Liana's room, brushing her face with gentle warmth, but it could not chase away the memory of the night at the old estate. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail. The feel of his hand in hers, the gravity of his gaze, the way he had spoken of destiny as if it were tangible, as if she were meant to step fully into it. The sensation left her both exhilarated and fearful, a pull she had never experienced before, and she could not help but wonder what it truly meant to be seen, protected, and chosen by someone like the Alpha King. Yet, as the day unfolded, the ordinary world intruded with a subtle insistence. The streets were busy, merchants called out their wares, children ran laughing through the square, and townsfolk moved with a rhythm that seemed entirely untouched by the extraordinary event that had changed the course of her night. Liana felt an odd dissonance, the world moving on while her heart and mind lingered in a space that belonged to another reality entirely. Then, as if the universe had conspired to pull her further into that realm, a messenger arrived at her door. The seal on the parchment was unmistakable, carrying the emblem of the Alpha King himself. Her hands trembled as she broke it, revealing the message within. "Meet me at dusk by the Eastern Gardens. There is something you must see. Be ready for truths hidden even from the light." A shiver ran down her spine, not from fear alone, but from the magnetic pull of curiosity and anticipation. She dressed carefully, choosing something simple yet elegant, knowing instinctively that he had a way of seeing through pretense. By the time she reached the Eastern Gardens, the sun was already beginning its descent, casting long shadows across manicured hedges and marble fountains that glittered like molten silver in the fading light. He was waiting for her. Leaning casually against a stone balustrade, yet his presence commanded attention as if the world had bent itself to accommodate him. The Alpha King's eyes met hers, dark and unwavering, and she felt that same electric pull that had haunted her thoughts since their first encounter at the wedding feast. "You came," he said simply, the statement carrying approval and a hint of something deeper, something personal. "I did," she replied, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions coursing through her. "But why here? Why now?" He straightened, his gaze sweeping the gardens as if assessing their surroundings before returning to her. "Because some truths cannot be spoken indoors, where walls confine both sound and spirit. Out here, you can see clearly, Liana. And tonight, you will see things that will test what you believe about the world, and about me." Her pulse quickened. There was a dangerous gravity to his words, a promise wrapped in warning, and she realized that being near him was never simple. Even when he spoke softly, even when he smiled, there was a power in him that demanded attention, respect, and, increasingly, trust. He led her through the winding paths of the garden, past statues of forgotten heroes and fountains that shimmered in the twilight. The air was rich with the scent of roses and jasmine, intoxicating and disorienting, and she felt herself drawn deeper into his orbit. Finally, they arrived at a secluded alcove, hidden from all but the most attentive eyes. In its center stood a mirror framed in ornate silver, its surface reflecting not only the surroundings but something deeper, a doorway into the past. He gestured for her to look. Hesitant, she stepped forward, her reflection merging with a scene that shimmered like mist. And then she saw them, figures from his past, moments of loss, triumph, and betrayal that had shaped the man before her. The Alpha King's childhood, the pressures of leadership, the enemies he had made, and the allies who had fallen, they all unfolded in silent, spectral visions, as if the mirror were a vessel for memory itself. Her breath caught. She had always thought of him as untouchable, a figure of legend, impossible to understand. Yet here, in the quiet of the garden and the glow of the mirror, she glimpsed the reality beneath the legend, the weight he carried, the solitude he endured, and the strength required to survive it all. He stepped closer, his presence grounding her even as the vision swirled. "This is who I am, Liana," he said softly, his voice carrying the faint tremor of vulnerability. "Not just the Alpha King the world sees, but the man behind it, the man who has known loneliness, pain, and betrayal. And yet, even through it all, I have lived, and I have waited, for someone like you." She swallowed hard, emotions crashing over her in waves she could not control. Fear, awe, longing, and the stirring of a desire she had never allowed herself to feel intertwined within her chest. "Why me?" she whispered, the words fragile and questioning. He reached for her hand, the contact sending a pulse of warmth straight through her. "Because you see me, truly see me, without fear or judgment. And because, for the first time, I feel that perhaps someone is meant to share this burden, and this life, with me." The mirror shimmered again, fading into reflections of the night sky. Liana looked into his eyes, and in that moment, she understood that her world had shifted irreversibly. She was no longer the quiet girl hidden in shadows. She was a part of something larger, a story entwined with danger, power, and passion. And with him, she could face anything, because he had chosen her, and she had chosen him in return, even before fully understanding what that choice truly meant. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the gardens in hues of crimson and gold, the Alpha King drew her close, his hand firm at her waist, his presence a promise of protection and devotion. And in that embrace, Liana felt the first true stirrings of belonging, the realization that she was no longer alone, not in the halls of the estate, not in the vast world beyond, and certainly not in the shadow of the man who had claimed her attention, her trust, and, perhaps in time, her heart. The night stretched ahead of them, full of whispers, secrets, and the beginnings of a love that neither had anticipated but both could no longer deny. And as the stars appeared one by one, Liana felt an undeniable truth. Some encounters were not chance, and some stories were written long before the first chapter had even begun. The following days were unlike anything Liana had ever experienced. Her life, once predictable and quiet, had become a careful dance between ordinary responsibilities and the extraordinary world the Alpha King had unveiled. Each morning, she awoke to memories of the old estate, the mirror in the garden, and the weight of his gaze, and each evening, she replayed the lessons of his presence in her mind, the way he had made her feel seen, powerful, and safe all at once. Yet, as intoxicating as his attention was, Liana could not ignore the subtle unease that shadowed her. She had been thrust into a world of influence and power far beyond her understanding, a realm where whispers could carry secrets and missteps could prove costly. Even with him by her side, the sense of precariousness was tangible, a reminder that her connection to the Alpha King was not only rare but dangerously exposed to scrutiny. It was on the 6th evening since their meeting at the Eastern Gardens that the first true test arrived. A messenger, cloaked and silent, delivered a sealed letter to Liana at her door. She recognized the emblem immediately, belonging to the Alpha King, but this time, there was no familiar warmth in the seal. Instead, it bore the mark of caution, a subtle warning etched in the form of an intricate insignia that suggested urgency and discretion. The letter read simply, "Meet me at the Western Tower. There are matters that cannot wait. Tonight, you must see the world as it is, not as it appears." Her heart raced with anticipation and apprehension. She dressed carefully, selecting a gown that was practical for movement yet elegant enough to suit the expectations of the estate. As she made her way to the western tower, the streets seemed unusually quiet, the city itself holding its breath as if aware of the significance of the night. When she arrived, the Alpha King was waiting, standing at the edge of the tower balcony, his figure outlined against the moonlit sky. His presence was commanding, his posture rigid yet natural, exuding a quiet authority that drew her in despite the tension in her chest. He turned toward her as she approached, and for a moment, the world fell silent. "Liana," he said, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who bore burdens unseen by most. "Tonight is not about comfort or romance. Tonight is about truth, and the truth is rarely gentle." Her pulse quickened. She had prepared herself for elegance and intrigue, for whispered secrets and tender moments, but his words carried weight, forewarning that this night would demand courage she was only beginning to understand she possessed. He led her through winding hallways of the tower, corridors lined with portraits of the past, a lineage of leaders, warriors, and those who had carried the burdens of their world with courage and consequence. The air grew cooler as they ascended higher, and with each step, the weight of anticipation pressed upon her chest. Finally, they reached the top of the tower, where the city sprawled beneath them, illuminated by thousands of lights flickering like stars fallen to earth. Here, the Alpha King paused, turning to face her fully. "Everything you have seen so far has been carefully curated," he said, voice low and deliberate. "A world filtered through the lens of expectation and civility. But what you must understand now is that the true power, and the true danger, lies in what lurks beyond appearances." Before she could respond, he gestured to the edge of the balcony. Liana's eyes widened as she saw figures moving below, shadows among the streets, men and women engaged in activities that spoke of secrets, schemes, and ambitions she had never imagined. The city, so vibrant in the daytime, revealed itself now as a living chessboard, each piece moving with purpose, and each action carrying consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate moment. "These are the players," he explained, his hand brushing lightly against hers, grounding her in the reality of his world. "Every action has a consequence. Every choice you make can alter the balance of power, for better or worse. And you, Liana, are now a part of this game, whether you realize it or not." Her stomach tightened at the gravity of his words. She had imagined adventure and romance, perhaps intrigue, but this was something far more complex and perilous. And yet, as she looked up at him, standing resolute against the night sky, she felt a spark of determination ignite within her. She would not falter. She would not shrink. Not when he had chosen to trust her with a glimpse of this world, not when he had shown her the power she herself could wield if she dared to embrace it. He leaned closer, his dark eyes piercing into hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Do you trust me?" he asked, voice low, almost a whisper against the night wind. "Yes," she replied without hesitation, though her heart raced. "I trust you." "Good," he murmured, a hint of approval in his tone. Then step forward, not as the girl who once sat alone at a wedding feast, but as someone who can navigate shadows and light alike. "Tonight, you will see who I am, and you will also see yourself." He guided her down a spiral staircase into the heart of the city, where the lantern-lit streets revealed another layer of life, one filled with schemes, alliances, and tensions carefully hidden from the casual observer. Liana's eyes widened as she realized the scope of the world she had been drawn into, a world where the Alpha King's influence extended far beyond the boundaries of the estate. She had seen power before, but never such a delicate, calculated control, the kind that demanded respect, strategy, and courage. For hours, he led her through secret paths, introducing her to allies and adversaries alike, showing her the subtleties of influence and persuasion that governed this hidden society. Every step was a lesson, every interaction a revelation, and Liana felt herself growing, learning, and discovering a strength she had never known she possessed. By the time they returned to the tower, the first hints of dawn were brushing the sky with pale light. Liana's legs were weary, her mind buzzing with new knowledge, yet she felt exhilarated, alive in a way she had never experienced. The Alpha King stood close, his presence steady and reassuring, and she realized that despite the danger, the intrigue, and the overwhelming complexity of his world, she would follow him anywhere. As the sun rose, spilling gold across the city, he finally spoke, his tone softer now. Most intimate. You have done well, Liana. Not because the tasks were simple, but because you faced them with courage, curiosity, and an openness I rarely encounter. Remember this night. Remember what you have learned, not just about me, but about yourself. She looked up at him, the bond between them strengthened by the shared experience, and felt the first real stirrings of confidence. She was no longer the girl who sat alone at a wedding feast. She was Liana, seen, trusted, and slowly discovering her own strength within the orbit of a man who had claimed her heart, her attention, and her destiny. And as the city below awakened, she realized that the shadows she had once feared were not threats, they were lessons, and with him, she would navigate them all. The days after the night in the Western Tower were a whirlwind for Liana. The world she had stepped into was no longer a distant fantasy, it was real, pressing against her every thought, every heartbeat. The Alpha King's presence lingered in her mind as if a shadow and a light intertwined, casting her entire existence in a glow she had never known. Every glance from him, every word he spoke, carried weight, authority, and a subtle intimacy that made her pulse quicken, and she could no longer deny the growing pull in her chest, a connection that went far beyond curiosity or fascination. Yet, as exhilarating as it was, there was tension woven through it. Power came with vigilance, and trust with caution. Liana could feel it in the way he moved through his world, commanding respect effortlessly, observing everything, noting every detail. She had glimpsed it in the secret paths of the city, in the strategic whispers of allies, and in the subtle glances of adversaries. The life he lived was dangerous, beautiful, and overwhelmingly complex. She could not pretend to understand it all, but she could feel its gravity pressing against her, pulling her deeper into his orbit. That evening, the Alpha King requested her presence at the estate once more. She arrived to find the grand hall quieter than usual, the usual clamor of servants and guests replaced by a rare stillness, almost reverence. He waited for her in the center of the room, tall and commanding as always, yet there was something different tonight, something in the set of his shoulders, the intensity in his eyes, that made her heart flutter with anticipation. "You are punctual," he remarked, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Good. We have much to discuss, and some truths cannot wait." "Truths again?" Liana asked softly, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension coloring her tone. "I feel like every time I step into your world, there's another secret waiting for me." "Because life is layered, Liana," he replied, stepping closer. "And understanding it, Rekha. Iris more than observation, it requires courage, honesty, and sometimes, a willingness to confront what you fear the most." Her gaze met his, searching for the underlying meaning, and found only the steady, unwavering confidence that had drawn her to him in the first place. She realized that he was not merely testing her, he was guiding her, challenging her to step fully into the strength she had never acknowledged in herself. He led her to a secluded chamber in the estate, a room she had never seen before. The walls were lined with books, scrolls, and artifacts from centuries past. Candles flickered softly, casting dancing shadows across the room, and the air was heavy with the scent of parchment and something faintly floral, a fragrance she could not place but found strangely comforting. "Sit," he instructed, gesturing to a chair beside a large, ornate desk. She obeyed, and he took the seat opposite her. "Tonight, you will learn not just about me, but about the forces that shape everything around us." He opened a large, leather-bound ledger, flipping its pages with deliberate care. "These are records of the past, decisions, alliances, betrayals. They show the paths that were taken, and the ones that could have been. And you, Liana, are about to play a role in the choices yet to come." Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the desk, a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation coursing through her. She had felt the thrill of adventure before, had experienced moments of exhilaration in his presence, but this was different. This was not a dance or a fleeting encounter, this was real, tangible, and it carried weight she had never imagined. He looked at her, his dark eyes softened by something she had only glimpsed before in fleeting moments, a hint of vulnerability, a trace of unspoken trust. "You have been brave," he said quietly, "and more capable than you realize. But there is a choice you must make tonight. Not about loyalty, not about power, but about your heart. Are you willing to trust me completely?" The question struck her deeply. It was not one he had asked lightly. Trust was not given freely in his world, it was earned through observation, courage, and shared experience. And yet, she felt something stir in her chest, a certainty that this was where she belonged, that the life she had once feared she would never touch was now within reach. I trust you," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor of emotion. He inclined his head slightly, as if confirming an unspoken understanding, and the tension between them shifted. The air seemed to hum with electricity, charged with possibility and intimacy. "Good," he whispered, leaning forward slightly. "Because trust is the foundation. Everything else, the power, the danger, the passion, it grows from here." For the first time, he reached across the desk, brushing a hand against hers, a gesture so simple yet so intimate that her heart leapt uncontrollably. She could feel the warmth of his skin, the steady strength beneath his touch, and the unspoken promise that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. Hours passed as he revealed fragments of his past, stories of victories and losses, of responsibilities that weighed heavily, and of a loneliness he had rarely shared with anyone. Liana listened, enraptured and empathetic, understanding for the first time that behind the Alpha King's formidable exterior was a man shaped by circumstance, guided by purpose, and longing for connection just as fiercely as she longed for belonging. As the night deepened, the conversation shifted from the weight of legacy to the subtler, quieter moments, memories of laughter, fleeting joys, and unguarded dreams. Liana found herself laughing softly at his dry humor, marveling at the rare glimpses of softness he allowed only in her presence. It was a delicate balance, power and vulnerability, command and intimacy, and she realized that she had never known a connection like this before, one that demanded her full presence, courage, and heart. Finally, he stood, closing the ledger with a deliberate thud that echoed softly in the chamber. He reached out, offering his hand once more, and this time, she took it without hesitation, feeling the unspoken bond between them strengthen with every heartbeat. "Come," he said, his voice low and commanding. "There is one more truth you must face tonight, and it lies not in history or secrets, but in the choices we make together. Only then will you understand the depth of what it means to belong to me, and to the world I protect." And as she followed him into the night, Liana felt a mixture of fear, exhilaration, and certainty. She had stepped into a life that demanded courage and heart, and she knew, without question, that she would not turn back. Because with him, she had discovered a truth far greater than any she had ever imagined. That some connections were not merely chance, but destiny, and some hearts, once touched, could never again be unseen. The days after their evening in the candlelit chamber were filled with a strange mixture of exhilaration and unease for Liana. Every corner of the estate seemed to hum with anticipation, every shadow seemed to whisper secrets, and every glance from the Alpha King reminded her that her life was no longer her own, yet it had never felt more real. She moved through her daily routines with a sense of heightened awareness, her thoughts always drifting back to him, to the lessons, to the trust, and to the quiet thrill that had become the heartbeat of her existence. That morning began like any other, with the soft light of dawn filtering through her window, but an air of tension clung to the estate, subtle and almost imperceptible. The servants whispered amongst themselves, eyes darting toward the halls where the Alpha King walked, commanding without speaking. Liana sensed it, even before the messenger arrived, a small, neatly folded note, delivered with quiet urgency and sealed with his emblem. "Meet me at the Northern Gardens at sunset. There is something you must witness. Be prepared." Her pulse quickened. The wording of the message carried the same gravity she had come to recognize, a mixture of command and trust, urgency and anticipation. She dressed carefully, choosing clothing that allowed freedom of movement while maintaining the elegance expected within the estate's walls. Her mind raced with questions. What would he show her now? Was it a continuation of lessons, or something far more serious? When she arrived at the Northern Gardens, the sun was just beginning its descent, casting long shadows across fountains and manicured hedges. The Alpha King stood at the edge of a small cliff overlooking the valley beyond the estate, his figure framed by the fading golden light. The wind tugged at his dark hair, and his eyes, piercing and unreadable, were fixed on the horizon. "Liana," he said without turning, "I am glad you came. What you will see now is not merely a test, it is a glimpse of the reality that governs everything, the forces that shape lives, and the consequences of inaction. She approached cautiously, yet with a quiet determination. The gravity in his voice demanded attention, and she sensed that the moment she was about to witness would leave a permanent mark on her understanding of the world, and on her understanding of him. He gestured toward the valley, where figures moved with purpose, messengers, guards, and unknown individuals coordinating in ways she could not fully comprehend. There was a precision to their movements, a silent language of signals and responses that spoke of power, discipline, and control. It was a world Liana had never seen, yet somehow instinctively understood, an intricate web of influence and authority that the Alpha King navigated with ease. These are the threads of consequence, he explained, his voice low, almost reverent. Every decision, every action ripples outward. And while some may see only the surface, the true currents flow beneath, shaping destinies in ways few ever recognize. Liana's eyes widened, her mind struggling to absorb the scale of what he showed her. She had known power existed, had even glimpsed it in the city streets and in the hidden chambers of the estate, but this was mastery on a level she had never imagined. And standing beside the man who commanded it, she felt both fear and awe, an exhilarating realization that she was now part of this intricate tapestry. He finally turned to her, his gaze intense and unwavering. You have learned much, Liana. You have seen shadows and light, courage and consequence. But there is one more lesson you must carry with you, that trust and strength are inseparable. To belong to this world, you must embrace both, without hesitation, without doubt. She nodded, her chest tight with the weight of understanding. I will, she said softly, though her voice carried resolve. A faint smile touched his lips, almost imperceptible, yet it softened the commanding presence he always held. Good. Because what comes next will challenge everything you believe about yourself, about me, and about the life you are choosing. And you must be ready to face it, not as the girl who once sat alone at a wedding feast, but as the woman who is learning to stand beside me. The sky above shifted, the golden hues giving way to deeper purples and blues, as the first stars began to appear. The Alpha King reached for her hand, the simple gesture grounding her even as the magnitude of what lay ahead threatened to overwhelm. She could feel his strength, his confidence, and the unspoken promise of protection, and for the first time, she understood that belonging was not merely about proximity, it was about courage, trust, and shared purpose. Together, they descended the garden paths toward the valley, moving with silent precision. The closer they came, the more she realized the scale of the challenge, the alliances, the dangers, and the intricate dance of strategy and consequence that defined his world. And yet, with every step, Liana felt herself growing, becoming part of something larger, something both terrifying and beautiful. As night fell, the Alpha King stopped, pulling her close. The wind carried the scent of earth and flowers, mingling with the faint tang of distant fires from the city below. Tonight, he whispered, his lips brushing her hair, you will see not just the power I wield, but the depth of what it means to stand with me. And when you do, you will understand that there is no turning back, from me, from this world, or from the life you are beginning to claim as your own. Her heart pounded in response, a mixture of fear, exhilaration, and something far deeper, an unspoken longing that had grown with every shared glance, every lesson, every touch. She realized, in that moment, that she had chosen him, wholly and without reservation, and that whatever storms awaited, she would face them beside him. And as they looked out over the valley, the stars glimmering above and the shadows of unseen forces moving below, Liana understood a profound truth. Some connections were forged not in comfort or rtainty, but in challenge, trust, and shared courage. And with him, she would face every test, every secret, and every danger, not as a girl alone in the world, but as someone who had found her place, her purpose, and perhaps even her heart. The following week passed like a storm rolling across a distant horizon, ominous, relentless, and full of undercurrents that Liana could feel but not yet name. Life in the estate had grown increasingly complex. Every corner, every corridor seemed to hum with silent purpose. Servants whispered in hushed tones, guards moved with quiet efficiency, and the very walls seemed to hold their breath, anticipating events that none dared speak of aloud. For Liana, the days were both exhilarating and unnerving. She had grown stronger, more confident in the lessons he had given her, the subtle ways of reading people, the delicate dance of power, and the quiet art of observing without being seen. Yet, despite this growth, a tension lingered in her chest, a knot that refused to loosen. She knew instinctively that something had shifted in the city, in the world outside the estate, and that their lives were moving toward a reckoning she was not fully prepared to face. That evening, she was summoned to the private chamber of the Alpha King. When she arrived, he was already there, standing by the window, gazing out at the horizon where the last traces of sunlight faded into the encroaching night. His figure was strong, commanding, yet there was a subtle heaviness in the set of his shoulders that made her stomach tighten. "You've been attentive," he said without turning. "Observant. Courageous. And yet." He paused, his voice carrying a weight she could not ignore. "There are challenges ahead that will test more than skill or knowledge. They will test loyalty, heart, and the bond between us." Her chest tightened. She had grown accustomed to his intensity, to the gravity of his presence, but these words carried a darkness she had not yet faced. What is happening?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with fear and curiosity. He turned toward her, his gaze locking with hers, dark and unyielding. "There are forces moving against us," he explained, his tone measured but serious. "Enemies who seek to exploit weakness, to unravel what we have built. Tonight, you will see the reality of the danger that shadows this world, and you will understand why trust, courage, and strategy are inseparable." He extended his hand, and without hesitation, she took it, feeling the familiar surge of warmth and grounding that came from being close to him. Together, they moved through the estate, past corridors that were silent save for the echo of their footsteps, until they reached a hidden passage leading beneath the estate. Liana followed closely, her heart pounding in anticipation and apprehension. The passage opened into a chamber she had never seen before. Stone walls lined with ancient symbols, flickering torches casting shadows that danced like restless spirits, and at the center, a map etched into the floor in painstaking detail. He stepped onto the map, moving with precision, tracing routes and territories with the tip of his finger. "These are the areas of influence," he explained. "These are the territories controlled by allies, and these," he said, pointing to shadowed regions, "are held by those who oppose us. You will see tonight the stakes, the danger, and the necessity of careful planning." Liana leaned forward, absorbing every detail. The scale of what he revealed was staggering. She realized that the world she had glimpsed from the gardens, from the towers, and from the city streets was but a fragment of a far larger, more dangerous reality. And in that moment, she understood that her role, her presence, was no longer optional. She was entwined in his world, bound to the Alpha King by trust, courage, and the unspoken intimacy that had grown between them. Hours passed as he guided her through the chamber, explaining strategies, alliances, and potential threats. Each revelation deepened her understanding, sharpened her instincts, and strengthened her resolve. She began to see herself not as an outsider, but as a participant, an ally, someone who could act decisively and influence outcomes that mattered. Finally, he stepped close, the heat of his presence overwhelming the cool stone around them. "Tonight," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "you will confront fear, uncertainty, and the shadows that linger at the edges of our world. And when you do, you will see not only my strength but the strength you carry within yourself." Her breath caught. She had never been so aware of the depth of their connection, the way he saw her, trusted her, and demanded courage from her not through command alone, but through belief in her abilities. "I'm ready," she whispered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the mixture of fear and excitement that coursed through her. He nodded, a faint, approving smile softening the formidable intensity he always carried. "Good. Because what comes next will determine the future, not only for us, but for the lives intertwined with ours." "And Liana?" His voice softened further, almost tenderly. "When the storm comes, you must remember this. I do not face it alone, and neither will you. We are bound, not just by circumstance, but by choice, courage, and heart." And in that moment, standing in the flickering torchlight, Liana realized with a shock of clarity that she had never truly known what it meant to belong. She had once been invisible, alone, and uncertain. She stood beside a man whose world was vast, dangerous, and commanding, yet in his presence, she had found purpose, courage, and a love that demanded bravery as much as trust. The night outside deepened, filled with shadows, whispered threats, and the quiet hum of anticipation. And as they prepared to step into the unknown together, Liana felt the first true surge of confidence and clarity in her life. Whatever danger awaited, whatever challenges the world would throw at them, she knew she would face it beside him, with heart, with courage, and with the certainty that some connections, once forged, could never be broken. The night had stretched long, heavy with tension, whispers of danger, and the quiet, relentless pressure of unseen forces moving against them. For Liana, each moment had been a test, not only of courage and wit, but of trust, heart, and the bond she shared with the Alpha King. She had stepped into a world far larger, more dangerous, and more exhilarating than she had ever imagined. And now, standing at the edge of all they had endured, she felt a strange mixture of exhaustion, anticipation, and something far deeper: hope. The first hints of dawn colored the sky, streaks of gold and pink cutting through the night's shadows. She stood at the estate's highest balcony, the wind tugging gently at her hair, and watched the city below slowly awaken. The world seemed deceptively calm, but she knew better. She had seen the undercurrents, the webs of influence, the delicate balance between allies and adversaries, and she knew that even in peace, vigilance was required. Yet, for the first time, she also knew that she could face it all, not alone, but with him. The Alpha King appeared beside her, his presence a steadying force. He did not speak immediately, allowing her a moment to breathe, to let the events of the night settle in her mind. Then, his deep voice broke the silence. "You have done well, Liana. Braver than most, wiser than many, and stronger than you realize." She turned to him, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time, the usual intensity of his gaze was softened by something rare: affection, relief, and quiet pride. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, her voice low but resolute. "I never would have known how to face all of this alone." He smiled, a small, genuine curve of his lips that seemed almost foreign in its tenderness. "And you never will be alone, not while I can stand by your side. You are no longer the girl who sat quietly at a wedding feast, unseen and uncertain. You are someone who belongs, who commands attention, respect, and heart." Her chest tightened at his words. She felt a swell of emotion, gratitude, awe, love, all mingling together in a way that left her breathless. She had once believed her life was defined by solitude, by shadows, and by the careful avoidance of attention. Now, she understood that belonging, true belonging, was more powerful than fear. It was courage wrapped in trust, vulnerability tempered by strength, and love tempered by choice. He took her hand gently, bringing it to his lips and pressing a soft, deliberate kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was intimate yet commanding, a reminder of the bond they had forged in shared trials, whispered truths, and mutual trust. "Tonight tested us," he said softly, "but it also proved something essential. That together, we can face any challenge, overcome any adversary, and protect what is ours." The rising sun painted the city below in warm hues, and for a moment, the estate seemed to glow with possibility. Liana realized that the trials they had endured, the shadows, the threats, the whispered dangers, had not weakened them. Instead, they had forged a bond that was unbreakable, tempered by trust, courage, and the quiet intimacy of shared experience. He drew her closer, his hand resting lightly at her waist, the other brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Do you know what this means, Liana?" he asked, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. She shook her head, a small, almost hesitant smile tugging at her lips. "It means that from this moment forward," he continued, "you are not just seen. You are not just trusted. You are mine, as I am yours. And together, we will face whatever comes, because we are stronger together than we could ever be apart." Her heart leapt at his words, a thrill mingling with an undeniable warmth that spread through her chest. She had feared loneliness, uncertainty, and invisibility, but standing there with him, she realized that those fears were gone. She was known, cherished, and chosen, and for the first time in her life, she was certain that her place was not in shadows, but at the side of the man who had claimed her heart. He lowered his forehead to hers, and the world seemed to still around them. The wind whispered through the towers, the city below shimmered in the soft light, and time itself felt suspended. In that quiet, intimate moment, every hardship, every trial, every shadow they had faced together coalesced into clarity. Love, trust, and courage were no longer abstract concepts. They were tangible, real, and shared between them. Liana's lips curved into a full, genuine smile, and she whispered, "I'm with you, always." He smiled, his eyes dark and intense yet softened with undeniable affection. "And I with you. Forever." For the first time, the estate felt alive not just with the presence of power and authority, but with a sense of completion, fulfillment, and peace. The dangers and challenges would come again, as they always would in a world such as theirs, but in this moment, victory was theirs. Not through conquest or strategy alone, but through the bond they had forged, the trust they had nurtured, and the love they had discovered amidst shadows and uncertainty. As the sun rose fully over the horizon, bathing the city and estate in gold, Liana and the Alpha King stood together, hand in hand, heart with heart, ready to face the world not as separate individuals, but as a unified force, undaunted, unbroken, and unstoppable. The girl who had once sat alone at a wedding feast had become a woman who was seen, chosen, and loved beyond measure. And with him by her side, she knew that every dawn henceforth would be a new beginning, filled with courage, passion, and an unshakable bond that would endure beyond the trials of the world. Morning broke slowly over the estate, spilling golden light across the marble floors, garden terraces, and towering spires. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of blooming roses and fresh earth, a subtle reminder that life went on, even after storms, dangers, and trials that had once seemed insurmountable. Liana stood on the balcony, her hands resting lightly on the railing, the cool breeze tugging at her hair. She had never felt a sense of calm so profound, nor a sense of belonging so complete. The world was no longer vast and intimidating. It was a landscape she could navigate, a canvas upon which her life with him would unfold. The Alpha King appeared beside her, his presence immediately grounding. He was dressed simply this morning, though even simplicity could not hide the air of authority and strength that naturally surrounded him. He did not speak immediately, letting the quiet morning and the soft chorus of birdsong fill the air. When he finally turned toward her, his eyes, those intense, commanding eyes that had first drawn her into his world, were softened with tenderness, relief, and something that went beyond words. Pure, unguarded love. "You are awake early," he said, his voice low and steady, yet carrying a warmth she had come to crave. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, her lips curving into a small smile. "Too many thoughts, and I wanted to see the sunrise with you." His expression softened further, and he took her hand, bringing it to his lips and pressing a gentle kiss that made her pulse quicken, even after everything they had faced together. "Then we shall watch it together," he murmured, his thumb brushing against her skin in a familiar, grounding rhythm. "Because there is nothing more certain than this moment, and nothing more important than knowing that we face every dawn side by side." Liana's heart swelled at his words. She thought back to the girl she had once been, the one who had sat alone at a wedding feast, unseen, uncertain, and yearning for connection. She could barely recognize her past self, so different from the woman she had become, brave, confident, and fully alive. It was a transformation born of trials, of lessons, of trust, and above all, of love. Together, they watched the sun rise, painting the estate and gardens in hues of gold, pink, and soft amber. The birds' songs grew louder, blending with the rustle of leaves in a symphony that felt like a blessing upon their lives. Liana leaned into him, resting her head lightly against his shoulder, and felt the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. For the first time in her life, she understood what it truly meant to belong, not just to a place, not just to a title, but to a person, to a life, and to a shared destiny. The Alpha King spoke again, quietly, as if sharing a secret with only her and the morning itself. "Liana, everything we have faced, the shadows, the dangers, the uncertainties, has led us here. And now, the only path forward is together. We have survived, we have grown, and we have chosen each other. That choice, that is ours, always." She lifted her eyes to meet his, and in that gaze she saw the depth of emotion, the unwavering trust, and the love that had carried them through every trial. She reached up, brushing a strand of hair from his face, and whispered, "I choose you." Always. A faint, approving smile curved his lips, and he gathered her in his arms, holding her close in a way that left no doubt about the permanence of their bond. "And I choose you. Forever," he replied, his voice deep and unshakable. The morning stretched around them, warm and golden, full of promise. They remained on the balcony for long moments, hands entwined, hearts beating in sync, and spirits lifted by the realization that their trials had ended not with sorrow or loss, but with triumph, connection, and love. The estate, once a backdrop of shadows and uncertainty, now seemed to glow with the light of a future they would build together. In the days that followed, life settled into a rhythm both familiar and extraordinary. Liana discovered a new confidence in her role beside him, navigating the estate, the city, and the hidden intricacies of the Alpha King's world with grace and courage. The challenges never fully disappeared. There were always responsibilities, always whispers of intrigue, but they no longer carried fear. Instead, they were opportunities to stand together, to face whatever came with hearts united, and to grow stronger in their shared purpose. Evenings were spent in quiet companionship, in laughter and tender conversation, in moments of closeness that neither had dared to dream of in their separate pasts. The bond they had forged in shadows and trials blossomed into a love both powerful and tender, a love that was as much about shared strength as it was about vulnerability, trust, and unwavering devotion. One evening, as the sky blushed with the last light of day, the Alpha King took her hands in his once more, his gaze locking onto hers with quiet intensity. "We have faced the world together," he said softly, "and now, we can shape it as we choose. But know this, Liana. No matter what comes, no matter what storms may approach, my heart is yours, as yours is mine. Always." Tears of joy and relief glimmered in her eyes as she pressed her forehead to his, whispering, "And I will stand by you, in every dawn, every shadow, every heartbeat. Forever." The world seemed to sigh around them, a gentle promise in the rustle of leaves, the glow of lanterns, and the quiet rhythm of life continuing with purpose and beauty. And for Liana, the girl who had once been invisible, the woman who had sat alone at a wedding feast, this was more than a happy ending. It was a new beginning, a life filled with courage, love, and certainty, a life shared with the man who had shown her the meaning of belonging, trust, and the power of a heart fully seen. Hand in hand, heart with heart, they faced the rising moon and the waking city, knowing that together, they had everything. Love, trust, and destiny intertwined, they stepped forward into forever, undaunted, unbroken, and infinitely, blissfully, theirs. The estate glowed beneath the dawn, a silent witness to the promise of all that was yet to come. And for the first time in her life, Liana knew that every moment of solitude, every shadowed corner, and every uncertainty had led her to this one irrefutable truth: she was no longer alone. She had a home, a partner, and a love that would endure beyond trials, beyond fear, and beyond time itself.